Hi, and welcome back to History 101 or Political Science 101. It is the history of the American political system. We did part one and we got a little ways, and I'm pulling up the PowerPoint. We already discussed our objectives for this chapter on domestic policy, chapter 15. Okay, this is a really neat graph. It's on page 337, and it talks about your issue identification. That's really important. Agenda setting, policy formulation, policy evaluation, policy implementation, and policy adoption, which we talked about as well. We talked about Medicaid and Medicare. And just how I believe we talked at the beginning of the chapter how the United States is the last developed country. There's developed country, developing country, and underdeveloped. It replaces those words known as first world, second world, third world, because those are fixed. And I know that sounds like, oh, you're being politically correct, but actually it's not. When you're fixed in first, second, and third, countries can move. If you look throughout history, Iran was former Persia and was extremely developed in its day at one point in history, and now it would be probably considered developing. So those words developed, developing, and underdeveloped actually give historians some leeway and the ebb and flow of putting countries where they belong. So at that present point, and you can go backwards. And when you're talking about first world, second world, third world, it seems so fixed. So I know that seems crazy, but the more you think about it, the more it makes more sense. And do you want to be called a third world nation? Not so much. I really don't want to be. Do you want to be called a second world nation? No, I really don't. I prefer terms like developing nation or underdeveloped or developed. Sure, when you're a first world nation, you're fine with it. But when you're second or third, and there's actual criteria economically and industrially, not so fine with it. So, just kind of switching the scenario and seeing if you like those labels on yourself. Okay, so Medicaid and Medicare, federal spending. We talked about the CHIP health insurance program, which is just a wonderful thing. It covers all children that are too high for Medicaid, but we know health insurance is very expensive. Percentage of total national income spent on healthcare. Right. We have a graph that's on page 339. Okay. Right. Universal healthcare coverage. There was a huge issue in our text, was really the mandate, the individual mandate where you had to, or there was a penalty. It's called an individual mandate or a personal mandate. And that's where that fact is on page 340. As noted earlier, the United States has been the only economically advanced nation that did not provide universal health insurance coverage to its citizens. And it was attempted under Bill Clinton, and it was not received well. It wasn't received well this time either. And, it is a shame that, Democrats and Republicans couldn't work together better on it and come up with, a compromise. Because as we are studying this book on political science, what I'm seeing over and over again is that politics is supposed to be a compromise, not a deadlock. And, just having a son that's going in, and he's a political science and history double major. I think he's also communications in there as well. That's my hope that, both sides of the fence can come together, just as George Washington really had talked about how the two-party system would really divide the nation, and it is very sad. Okay, implementation of that, of the Healthcare Act started in October 1st of 2013, and of course you probably remember there's a lot of problems with things not working properly and the sign-up periods and that sort of thing. The federal site was not working very well. Many of the state sites, it notes, were working. Then we go on to energy policy. Okay. The problem of imported oil, global warming, and new energy sources. Imported oil, we import 42% of our petroleum. Oil imports are a potential problem because many of the nations that export oil are not particularly friendly to the United States. And before you assume that they did something to us, make sure you're very careful about your bias, because it's really interesting when you begin to uncover in history, you know, if we have imperfect leaders, sometimes we make some imperfect decisions, and that goes for any country. And, you know, some countries don't like us for this reason, and some countries don't like us for this reason, and sometimes they're reasons that we made ourselves. Just like a human has both good and bad, countries do as well. And, you know, I love the United States more than anything, but I also know that, you know, we're talking about patriotic history here, one of our terms that we've talked about before. Please remember that patriotic history, one of our history analysis words, it means only sharing the good of a country, not talking about its shortcomings. And you really must talk about both, because if you have no problem, you can't fix problems. And that goes back to the beginning of this chapter as well. If you don't know what the problem is, you can't make a policy to fix it. All right, so the price of oil in July 2008, the price of oil spiked, forcing U.S. gasoline prices over $4 per gallon. President Obama issued fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, and the standards will be 39 miles per gallon for cars and 30 miles per gallon for light trucks. Okay, the global warming issue, climate change, it's also known as climate change. Most climatologists believe that this global warming is a result of human activities, and I think that's what we need to focus on. I mean, I've been around camps that don't believe that global warming is even real. They think it's completely a farce. But, you know, as you start reading, you know, in academia, you realize that really it is happening. Okay, you can't ignore it. You know, you may disagree as the causes or as to why or where they come from. And I just would, you know, really, as a historian, science is not my thing. But going back to the academic reasonings and support in facts, rather than, you know, getting your information from talk show radio hosts and that sort of thing. You know, we have to be careful. Those, you know, people make us think, but it's up to us to get our own ideas and look at our own biases. So climate change is kind of controversial, and it's very polarized between Republicans and Democrats. It's very politicized, highly politicized, as it says on page 343. And, you know, I think now it's moving from being a hoax to something of, you know, it's reality, but, you know, did humans cause it, or was it caused naturally? So I think that's kind of where the bickering is kind of leading. New energy sources. Expanded supplies of oil and natural gas. Okay. Yeah, you already talked about that. All right. In 2011, U.S. exports of petroleum products exceeded imports for the first time since 1949. So we've relied heavily, and if you read about the Carter days where, you know, there was a big gas shortage, and, you know, I remember my parents telling me about waiting in line at the gas station. If you had an even number or an odd number, whether or not you got to get gas that day. I vaguely remember as a little girl sitting in a car forever in a gas line, but, you know, just having my parents explain, you know, that sort of thing, that put us in a crunch, in a crisis, and Americans were not happy about it. So figuring out what to do about energy sources, you know, they are going to run out. You know, what can we do? So you have the natural gas boom, you have the fracking revolution, an extraction technique, more cost effective. But there are a lot of people against fracking, and I know in my own township there is some fracking issues, and they don't want things to happen to the neighborhoods and things in the area. So it is a huge issue. Fracking, let's go ahead and talk about the definition. Technique for extracting oil or natural gas from underground rock by the high-powered injection of a mixture of water, sand, and chemicals. Okay. And that also is why it's possible the United States have ramped up their oil and natural gas production. Okay. Talking about the water service companies and managing chemical tainted water. New energy sources, offshore drilling, which Republicans, really wanted more drilling to open up. And then in 2010, there was a great catastrophe where in April, a drilling platform exploded. And just a huge tragedy. I believe there's a movie out right now about that true story. New energy sources, nuclear energy, concern of dangers. I know, again, growing up in a small Ohio town, I would say 5 miles from me, 5, maybe 10 miles, they were building a nuclear energy plant when I was younger. And they switched over to fossil fuels because there was so much protest and just worry due to different nuclear crises all over the world, whether it's, Russia or Japan. Okay, economic policy, delving deeper into domestic issues. Okay, and you've got actions taken by the government to address ups and downs, recession. The rate of unemployment is a huge economic policy issue measured by a government survey. People who are looking for a job. Inflation is a sustained rise in average prices. And then we have monetary policy involving changing the amount of money in circulation as to affect interest rates. Okay, which there's a lot of controversy over such. Conservative reaction. Conservatives have become alarmed by the activist policies of the federal government. Radical conservatives advocate a hard money policy, which is completely tied to a gold standard or a silver standard. Okay. Fiscal policy, the use of the changes in government spending and taxes to alter national economic variables. Right. We're going to talk about this economic theory, Keynesian economics, that was proposed by British economist John Maynard Keynes, that is typically associated with the use of fiscal policy to alter national economic variables. So when there's a crisis, to do something about it. Let's go back one. Okay, U.S. fiscal policy is associated with British economist Keynes, that we just talked about. Keynes and the Great Depression. What's really awesome about when you're studying the New Deal and FDR is people just were not, they were afraid to make the jumps that FDR did. And, his drastic measures really did save our country, the New Deal and the spending at that time. Government begins borrowing when private sector stops. Some economists believe the spending on World War II. World War II broke the back of the Great Depression, which I think, according to the historians I know, that was what really pulled us out completely as a country. Talking about Keynes and Obama, right? Federal tax system, tax loopholes, and reaction syndrome. For every government action, there will be a reaction by the public. All right. You have tax rates for single persons and married couples. Will we ever have a simple tax system? That's a great question. And linking it back to the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Public debt, talked about public debt and the burden of public debt. All right.